Hello and welcome to my game genre tier list video. This is not going to be a typical tier list video where we rank each game genre based on how fun they are or what we like the most. I'm going to rank it based on what skill level I think it is appropriate for when you're developing games. So if you are a noob, which game genres would be good for you to start developing games with, and also what would be a good challenge if you're, let's say, an advanced game developer or an expert. So it's gonna be a semi-serious video. I'm gonna give my thoughts about each game genre and rank it on a tier list. And also for some special game genres, I created this special tier, trash tier, which is something that you should never try to do basically. So let's start. First thing that we have is platformer game genre. So we also have this nice graph which is gonna show us what I think are the best skill levels for this genre. Of course, even those that are kind of ranked low doesn't mean they're bad for it, but I'm just gonna give why I think it might not be the best for that skill level. So let's start with platformers. One reason why I think it's really good for this lower level when you're a noob or a beginner is because you have a really limited scope that you need to work with, and you're kind of working with pure basics. So you don't have any open levels, you don't have any complex stuff. Usually you just have one level. You can start with 2D or 3D platformer. I think they are kind of similar. The only thing is that there is maybe a little bit more complexity with the 3D platformer because you just have one more axis. But in general, you're gonna have similar stuff. Even if you are just started making games, you're completely new, you are like 1 or 2 weeks in, and you want to kind of start creating a game, I think this is kind of a good one to start with, just because you can start with pure basics. So you need to make your character go left and right, you need to make your character jump, and that's kind of enough for this genre to already make it work. With some other genres, you maybe need the ability system, inventory, UI. For a platformer, you can basically do just pure basics. Even for a 3D one, you just need like a jump and just a character that moves around. And you don't even have to be fancy with the character, you can just make it like a cube or something. Now the reason why I made it kind of low for intermediate events is because it's really basic mechanics. It can kind of get less challenging. So usually when you go into that intermediate advanced level, it gets a little bit less challenging if you want to kind of do a typical platformer. But I think it can kind of get again more interesting when you go more advanced, because you can start playing around with some really unique and specific mechanics for platformers. I think I saw somewhere a game where you can play it like 2D or 3D, where you kind of become a painting or you're in the wall and you walk and stuff like that. You can do some crazy stuff, but it's gonna be some really advanced stuff. Or you have platformers that are really polished, which for noobs or beginners, like when you start out, it's gonna be clunky, it's gonna be weird, but it's gonna work, so that's kind of good. And also when you go intermediate advanced, usually I think you kind of start going a bit more wide. Wide, I mean you start experimenting a lot, especially in the intermediate level. You start trying out RPGs, FPSs, platformers, top-down games, so you kind of go really wide. In platformers, I think lose kind of some charm to it, but yeah. So now let's go to platformer and see where we're gonna put it. So noob and a beginner, I think for this one I'm gonna put in noob. Let me scale it down a little bit. Also, what we can do is maybe do something like this. I think also for beginners. Beginners I define like maybe you're like a month or 2 into game development, so you're still figuring things out, but you kind of have the basics, so you can kind of do some stuff. While noob is maybe somebody that is just like a week or 2 in game development. Okay, so let's go to the next one. Ooh, so we have an MMO. So here is how I see an MMO. MMO I don't think is good for anyone. MMOs are not something that a person makes, it's something that people make. So I don't think it's really for any skill level. I don't think it's for an expert. I think these MMOs are something that basically take every feature, take every mechanic, and you need to get that thing to 100. So if you're creating an MMO, that basically means, usually, of course you have exceptions, but usually that means it's gonna be an open world. You need to have a complicated inventory system, you need to have complicated ability system, you need to have the game that is balanced, you need the game that has like hundreds of people or thousands of people playing it on the server, you need to have complicated characters, animations, you have to have tons of content, hundreds of hours usually of content, you need to have a bunch of particle effects, sound effects, so it's like one of those things that if you're doing it alone, you're just completely screwed basically. I don't think it's it's basically for companies, it's for a bigger group of people. If you don't have at least 10 to 15 people of absolute experts that are trying to create an MMO, I don't think it's it's really for you. But maybe if for absolute experts I added this little thing, maybe there is something you can do if you're in here. Maybe you have something to do, but for us mortals, I don't think MMOs are a thing. So MMOs go to the trash category. Okay, don't do it. Just I know you want to, but just don't do it. Okay, next thing that we have is a big RPG. So for big RPGs, I think you're familiar with this graph already. Probably don't do it. Big RPGs, what I mean is, I was not sure how I can differentiate different RPGs. I was thinking maybe open world or something, but you can kind of have even smaller RPGs that are open world, but yeah, it's kind of gets weird. So what I named this is just big and small RPG. Big basically means that's your GTAs, Skyrims, Fallouts. That's really big games, usually 10, 20, 30 kilometers, 50 kilometers, whatever the size of the world is. Basically means you have like 10, 20, 50 hours of content. It means you have, again, similar to RPGs or big RPGs are kind of like MMOs, only without complexities of multiplayer. So it's basically all of the things where you have complex inventory system, complex UI, complex ability system, so it's a lot of stuff. But as you can see, I added this bigger bump in here, so maybe if you're in here, you know, show us what you can do, but yeah, just don't do it. So big RPGs go into our special category. Now let's go to small RPGs. So for small RPGs, I think they are way more doable because we are basically cutting down on scope a lot, so that's how we can get some realistic expectations where we can actually do something. Now I think noobs or beginners should start with even a small RPG, and small RPG I usually mean the level is kind of constrained, or you have multiple smaller levels that are connected. You don't have tons of content, usually maybe let's say 1 to 5 hours of content, maybe not even that. Usually you have some ability system, but it's not too complicated. You maybe have some list of skills to choose from, maybe you have some simple leveling system. You have inventory, so everything is kind of scaled down to like 1/10 of the size of a big RPG, but you still have all of those elements. And because you have all of those elements, I wouldn't recommend it even for like the beginner or maybe even like starting intermediate level, which I'm kind of looking at intermediate like maybe let's say 6 months to a year of experience with an engine. So if you're in that scale, maybe even that the RPG might be a bit challenging, but I think the challenge will be good there, where you kind of have the basics and now you need a bit of challenge where you have different functionalities, mechanisms, stuff like that you need to combine and start working on it. So yeah, I think intermediate and advanced are the best skill levels for this. Advanced because it's challenging and you can actually make it polished and nice, and intermediate because it's challenging enough where you might make like a not so polished RPG, but you can still make something like that. And for expert, I think there is some different, we're gonna also go over some different genres that might be better for an expert level, but yeah, this one I think shines in intermediate advanced. So let's take our small RPG, I'm gonna put it in here, scale it down, and I'm gonna also put it in here. So now we have fighting games. This one might look a bit weird, there is like this modal distribution here, but basically what I mean by this is I think fighting games might be good for a beginner going to intermediate level, just because you can make it very constrained and you can have some basic stuff that you can kind of learn with fighting, so the scope is again way more limited and there is not a wide range of stuff that you need to learn with fighting games. So there is some stuff like hitboxes, inputs, maybe like basic combos that you can start working on where you press 2 buttons and something needs to happen. And I think stuff like that might be challenging but interesting for a beginner. And I think intermediate level you kind of start realizing all the complexity of the fighting games, so maybe you get discouraged. And also I think when you're intermediate you kind of go more wide, so specializing fighting games might not be that interesting when you want to explore all of these different genres. So I think the interest picks up when you go into advanced and more expert level, where you kind of start doing more than whatever the beginner would be doing for a fighting game, where you have basic stuff like moving around, clicking button to punch, and calculating stuff with hitboxes. When you go into more advanced, you're gonna think about stuff like frame data, so what happens in a certain frame, how you can think about complex moves that you execute with different inputs. You have stuff like input buffering, or how you even create hitboxes, what triggers when. There's some hitboxes that need to trigger only one frame and stuff like that, so how you manage all that gets very complex for fighting games. especially if you're trying to create a competitive fighting games. You also need to then think about netcode. Are you gonna have a rollback netcode, or is it gonna be something else? So how are you gonna manage basically delays and latency in a game that needs split-second reactions and stuff like that? So it gets very interesting in more advanced level, but I think it's also accessible for the beginners because you can use some basic stuff and create a fighting game, and there is no complex stuff like multiplayer. You don't need multiplayer, you don't need any complex AI, you don't need complex animations and stuff like that, so it might be also good for beginners. So fighting game, I'm gonna put it, I think, in here, and we're gonna put it in advanced. Okay, so next one is action adventure. This one has wide range of interests where you kind of have to have a world, you have to have something to explore, and you also have to have some type of ability or spellcasting system or fighting system. You can't not have these two things, and they also include like UI, they also include world building content, so I think that's where complexity lies, so that's why you're gonna probably not do anything with it or find it too challenging if you're a noob or a beginner, but when you start going to intermediate or advanced, it is gonna be way more interesting for you, and the scalability is huge with this, so you can have like a smaller contained adventure, or you can have a big adventure like Legend of Zelda or stuff like that. There is also some big action adventure games that you probably should stay away from. They are basically big RPGs, so you don't want to even try to make them, so that can be like something like God of War or Batman Arkham Asylum games, stuff like that. So you kind of want to stay into like small RPG area but with action adventure elements instead of RPG elements. So action adventure, I'm gonna put it again in two places. Ooh, this gonna barely fit. Can I change this? Let's put it like this, and also let's put it in here. So now let's go to sports genre. So this one was tough. I think this genre has a lot of possibilities, and it's such a wide genre that maybe I should have somehow tried to contain it, but you could go all the way from like FIFA or something where you have a multiplayer football game, or you can go to something smaller like basically have a cube with hockey sticks where one player just plays against AI, or have simple local multiplayer game or something like that. So you can create a wide range with this, and I think it can be, I think this is kind of specific to a person. I think some people just don't like sports games, some people really like them. So I think in most of these skill levels, I think it's fine to kind of experiment and try this. I think this will mostly be driven by interest, only for the noobs, because sports game usually requires some sort of AI or some sort of multiplayer, or at least local multiplayer. So I would avoid this for noobs. It might be interesting for beginners to create a really simple local multiplayer game where you have controls for WSAD and then arrows. Something like that might be interesting and challenging for a beginner to make. And I think it kind of can be interesting for every level. You could create something like, not like Rocket League, but some smaller version of it, where you have few players running around doing stuff. And I think this is probably the most interesting for expert levels, because then you can actually do stuff like make a proper tennis game, make a proper rugby game, do stuff like that. So I think if you're a sole developer and an expert, I think sport games is something that you will find challenging and will be able to do. Also kind of for advanced. But if you're a beginner, you can still make a way simpler version of a sports game that can still be a complete game. So that's kind of a nice thing about it. So I'm not exactly sure where to put this one. I think I'm gonna put it for experts. I think this is one thing that it's kind of good for everyone except maybe noob level, and also beginner, maybe not the best, but yeah, I think expert level is the best for a sports game, for a proper sports game. So let's now go to stealth. So stealth, this might be controversial, but I think stealth games are really good for like a beginner level, just because the mechanics can be generally simple, but they do introduce some challenges. So challenges that they introduce is enemy AI, but it doesn't require such a complex enemy AI where you have to have a bunch of different states, they have to react to stuff, they have to chase player. Usually you can create a stealth game where if an enemy sees you, the game is over, and you can have like a patrolling route, or you can have like cameras that just rotate around and have some simple perception view, or the character just making noise when he's walking and not making noise when he's crouching. So systems for a stealth game can be simple enough that I think could be good for like a beginner noob level. And it's also, this genre is also wide enough that you can actually make it interesting. for like intermediate advanced, but I think it's kind of challenging to make it interesting for like an expert level developer, where a lot of mechanics for a stealth game are usually more simple, and when you go to the expert level you usually want some challenge. So stealth game, I think I'm gonna put it beginner intermediate level. I think that's kind of the best. We could also put it in a noob level, but let's reserve that for something else if we find it. So this one also might be a little bit controversial, just because I think most people would put beat 'em up to maybe be more accessible to noobs or beginners. But I think since beat 'em ups kind of require a bit more content and also AI, I think it kind of gets more challenging. So I think it's the most interesting to people that are more intermediate or advanced. Basically what I mean is, for beat 'em ups usually you need to have some sorts of AI because you're kind of fighting through groups of AIs. You do need to have some content, so your character needs to progress. You need to go through some, let's say, streets or forest, stuff like that. You actually need the content. So the more content you need, I think the difficulty and skill level increases that is needed to create this type of genre. So I think beat 'em ups in general are the most interesting for like intermediate, advanced maybe type of game dev. So I'm gonna put beat 'em up, I think, into intermediate level, squeeze it in there. And now we have survival. So for survival game, it can also kind of have a wide range of what it means to be a survival game. But I think for most versions of it, I think it needs a lot of experience and usually even a small team to a medium team to make it work properly. So when you think of a survival games, you might think of The Forest, you might think of, let's say, Rust, Don't Starve. Those games are kind of probably out of reach of even expert level devs, but there are some smaller versions of survival games that you can make, and there are also some exceptional games that would go into survival genre, like maybe Terraria, Minecraft, stuff like that were created by one person or a smaller group of people, which kind of lets you know that it is actually possible, but it's going to be very hard. It's going to be for more skilled gamers. So I'm going to put this into a advanced and expert level. And if you're wondering, this tier list, this really nice looking tier list was actually created in DALL-E 3 in ChatGPT, and I'm actually surprised how well it can take directions. So it kind of created this for me, basically. Pretty nice. Okay, now we have battle royales. So this one is, yeah, one of those that you just shouldn't try it if you're solo, even an expert dev. I wouldn't recommend it for any skill level, just because, again, it's a multiplayer. It needs to be very balanced, a lot of content. You need to usually complex leveling system, skill level, some type of marketplace, maybe skins. You can have a bunch of stuff that you need, and even if you're a really good game dev, this is just gonna be very challenging to make. So let's put it in the just don't do it category here. Now we have a multiplayer online battle arena, and this one I think is a bit more doable than battle royale, but also very unlikely to be finished even by an expert developer. The reason for this, I think why it's a bit more achievable than, let's say, something like battle royale, is because usually the maps are smaller and there is kind of a contained scope in which you work in. Even though you have like an ability system, you need to worry about networking, matchmaking, stuff like that. There is just a little bit less content and a little bit less stuff that you have to do. So even if you're a solo developer, there is some limited version of a MOBA game that you can actually finish up, I think. But you really need to be in this area here. If you are intermediate or something, or beginner, I just don't even touch this one. So this one, I think I'm gonna put it in the expert, but also probably don't do it even if you are an expert. Usually these games are the games that people make, not a person makes, so you just need a team for this. So next thing that we have is a casual genre. This one is probably the best when you're starting out to kind of learn some basics of game making, maybe beginner level, but I think this game genre is usually not what people want to make when they go into game development, so it's usually not very motivating. So even if you could do it, you usually don't really want to work on casual games. So this might be like Candy Crush like games, Town Scraper, it can be some small mobile games that are usually very repetitive and you rank up some points, coins or whatever. Usually not the genre that people are motivated to do too much. In this I also include like hyper casual games. This is usually some mobile games, but also just generally casual games. So let's put this one, I'm gonna put it in the noob and beginner level. So now we are up to the shooters. Shooter genre is pretty wide, so you can see this line is pretty horizontal, but the reason why I kind of put it good for all three of these categories is because the shooter genre can be quite big. You can have fast shooters, strategic shooters, bigger map like Battlefield, or smaller map like Counter-Strike. You can have it in a dense forest, you can have it on an island or wherever. The scenarios for a shooter game I think can be wide, and also shooter game I think can be appealing to a lot of people. But I wouldn't just recommend it for beginners, just because, yeah, working with first person, how you can manage what the character sees, how he moves. You also need, for shooters, there is few things that you need to do, like nice UI. Usually you need to add stuff like pickups, weapon swapping, reloading, animations for the weapons and stuff like that. So there is kind of a bit more content that I think you don't want to focus when you're a beginner. You just want to do a few basic mechanics for a game. But when you go into intermediate level, I think shooters can be very interesting and challenging to make. And of course advanced and expert if you want. When you go to more advanced and expert levels, I think you start working with multiplayer, you start working with netcode, with managing multiple players, matchmaking, and that can be interesting and challenging for shooters. So shooters are gonna go into 3 categories, I think. I'm gonna put them all the way here. Now we have strategy games. These ones, I think, are pretty much reserved for more veteran game devs, just because usually with strategy games you need to manage multiple units, you need to have the whole building system, usually you need to have or an AI or some multiplayer or local multiplayer. You can also make turn-based or real-time strategies, and for turn-based you might also need to manage turns, and that maybe you can create like a local multiplayer or something, but that might be challenging. So yeah, strategies I think get more complicated, especially if you have like a tile-based game. You need to also deal with that. This might be more accessible if you're using specialized game engine for it. Same with, like, let's say an RPG, so there is like RPG Maker or something, so that might be more accessible to beginners. But in general, this strategy genre, I think to finish a strategy game, you do need to have a decent amount of experience making games. Okay, so let's see where we're gonna put strategy. I think it's gonna go to advanced and expert level. So for racing games, I think they can be somewhat accessible when you're a beginner, because usually you can just have a simple car rig, a simple basically box that you can kind of move around and have some simple controls with, and that is already kind of a game. You can set up maybe checkpoints or something, and you can already make a simple game loop for racing games. But when you go into intermediate and start exploring different genres, I think you kind of get an idea of how to create a proper racing game, but it is very challenging for intermediate skill level developers. So I think when you go into more advanced and expert levels, the racing games feel reachable. You feel something like you can do properly, where you have car dynamics and racetracks and even multiplayer. But I think it gets more achievable with the more skill you acquire. So I'm gonna put racing games, I think, in the advanced category. I think that might be the best for it. Now horror might be an interesting one. So I think horror might be decently accessible just because it has simple mechanics and you can do a lot even if you don't have much experience making games. Just because you can have a character that just walks around, usually in 3D, but you can do it in 2D. And usually he has some limited field of view, or he walks slow, something like that. And then you can do a lot of stuff with sounds, with visuals, and make a horror game, which with a lot of genres you can't. You need to have some type of like build system, multiplayer ability system, but with horror you don't really care about all of that. You can basically make a full horror game just having simple character with simple controls, and then having a world that has some triggers for some sounds and stuff like that. so I think it's way more accessible. I'm not sure for this noob, maybe I should have put it a bit lower, but I think the beginner might be ideal spot for like working on a game that is challenging enough, has some content that you need to make, but the controls are simple enough, so you should be able to, even as a beginner, create a simple horror game where character walks around and stuff is triggered basically. So I'm gonna put this one, I think, in the beginner level, and we're gonna leave it out of the noob level because I think it's generally ideal just for beginners. Now for visual novels, I think these types of games usually have their own game engines, and usually you wouldn't create them from scratch in some other game engine. So I think for noobs or people that just try to get into game making, visual novels might be accessible just to teach them how to create something interactive. So you can have engines like a RandPy or some other visual novel game engines that makes it really simple to create visual novels, but you won't learn much regarding game development in general. You're gonna specifically learn this amount about creating visual novels in that specific engine. So I think people that are starting out with game development and just are also interested maybe in visual novels, I think this is nice. But I think when you start kind of learning, or if you want to start learning game development and want to kind of learn game development in general, this is not really a good idea to start with. And if you want to create visual novels from scratch in some game engine that is more general, this is probably for more like intermediate level. And I also put a little bump in here for advanced and expert skill level, just because there are some interesting things, interactive things that you can do with visual novels. They do not have to be as basic as you click left click and skip to the next conversation dialogue piece. So for this, I think I'm gonna put it exclusively in the noob level. I think that's fine. Now we have an interesting one, which is interactive movie. This one I would explain as a telltale game, or a game where you have almost like a cinematic, or you have a thing that is playing and your interactions are mostly picking choices or quick time events, and then the rest of the game is kind of like a movie that you watch. So there was a game Until Dawn, I think is a good one. You have Wolf Among Us. You have games like The Walking Dead, so that's kind of interactive type. I think these ones, I'm not even sure if I put them in advanced level. I think if you're an expert, you have a chance to create something, but this type of game is 90% of content and 10% of some technical stuff. So you do have to have characters that are talking, interacting, stuff needs to be happening, there needs to be a branching tree of choices. So there is a lot of content. So this is probably gonna be for people that or can 3D model or can kit bash or can do stuff like that. But this might be also one of the things where, you know, a group of people makes. It's usually not one person that can create good interactive movie, especially since you need content for this. So that means that you need to make this be at least few hours long to actually make it like a worthwhile game. So if you make it like 10-minute piece, it's probably, I mean, you could do it and it still would be technically interactive movie game, but usually you want to make it at least like 1 to 2 to 3 hours or something like that. So this one I think is pretty close to Never Do It land, but I'm gonna put it in this region, especially since engines like Unreal Engine make it way more accessible to actually be able to do something like this. If we were talking like 3 to 5 years ago, this would definitely be in this category because it would just be way too hard to get content. But right now you have a lot of free stuff, you have stuff like MetaHuman, Quixel, assets, stuff like that, so it does get a bit more accessible. So puzzle genre is kind of general and it has a lot of simple mechanics at its core. So I think that's why beginners should go for this type of game. So puzzle game usually involves some type of simple movement from the character, and then you usually have some simple interactions like opening the doors, standing on a pressure plate or something like that, moving things around. So usually there is some simple interactions and you just have a basic player. So just because you have more than like 1 or 2 mechanics, I think I wouldn't put it for a noob developer, but when you have like a few months in a game engine, I think you can start working with puzzle games and you can start experimenting. And I think when you get more skilled, the mechanics are not that exciting for puzzle games, but of course you can always challenge yourself. Even if you're advanced expert, there's some puzzles you can make, like 4D game or something, and make it challenging. So there is always challenges, but I think it works mostly for intermediate beginner type of game developer. So let's put it into beginner and I'm gonna copy it to intermediate. So now we have a sandbox, and this one I'm kind of torn about between not being achievable to being somewhat achievable. Sandbox usually means you have like open to semi-open world, and you have a lot of options for you to be creative or do stuff. So this might be a game like, I don't know, Roblox, Minecraft, Starbound. There is a lot of sandboxy games where you have a world and then you can explore or just make stuff in the world. I think that's the reason why it's not that accessible, because first you need a big world and then you need a lot of features, a lot of options for the player, and sometimes you even need like some AI interactions, some kind of leveling system even, and stuff like that. I think it is possible for some people to do it, but in general I wouldn't recommend it. It's usually the best for like a small team, 5 to 10 people. I think it's way more achievable to create a sandbox game than 1 to 2 people. So sandbox, I think I'm gonna put it in here, but also just to be realistic, probably don't do it if you don't have at least a small team of devs. So simulation games, also a bit harder to make if you're a beginner. So simulation games usually involve some aspect of reality that you're kind of trying to simulate. So that might be like Euro Truck Simulator, let's say Farming Simulator, Sims, stuff like that. So this one requires some technical knowledge. So if you're creating Euro Truck, you need to know something about European trucks. If you're doing stuff like a Farming Simulator, you do need to know stuff about farming equipment, how they are used, a life cycle of different plants and stuff like that. So there are some technical stuff. So except the knowledge, you also need to implement all those features, and you also need content. If you have a game like Euro Truck and the only thing you have is like a 5-minute gameplay track where player goes from one spot to the other, it's not going to be satisfying. So you need to have a decent amount of content and progression. Also for, let's say, Farming Simulator, Sims, you have to have a bunch of content. So I think you need to get to some level. Of course, you as alone, you wouldn't create something like Truck Sim, but there are some smaller simulation games that you can try and make. There is Farming Sims, Stardew Valley, that are created by a single person. That is something that you could create, but it would be difficult. Or better to say, it would be almost impossible. Usually creating games like Stardew Valley Soul is pretty hard. But there are smaller versions of simulation games that you could make. Like one that comes to mind is Paper Please or something like that. So you could create like a smaller version of simulation games. Something that is very limited. It can be like a simple cooking game where you have some recipes and you need to make stuff. But even for the simple games, I think you also need to have some skill level that is in this range. So let's put this to, I think, intermediate to advanced. I should have probably put it maybe in the expert, but we can leave it for now. I think usually when you go to expert level, usually want some type of multiplayer, more complicated game. So now let's go for a party game. So party games usually have one directed focus. I think the complexity for party games is usually they have to be local multiplayer or multiplayer. The word is party, so usually involves multiple people. So I think that's where the complexity lies. Otherwise, I would probably put this one to like new beginner. But you can think about like some simple card games or dice games or games like Uno that you could challenge yourself and create as like, let's say, an intermediate level developer. But usually they do not get more complex. You could create some more complex party games, which are basically casual fighting games or something like that can also be considered party. But usually when I think party games, I think more like family oriented or like groups of people playing like a board game or something like that. So usually doesn't involve some too complex or too much content or stuff like that. It's usually more contained. So let's put this one into the intermediate section. So for arcade games, this is the one that I would probably put it in like noob to beginner category, just because usually they have simple mechanics. And when I think of these games, it's usually something that when you start game development, this is kind of a good challenge to do. So games like Pac-Man, Space Invaders, some old school games that have simple mechanics. Usually you have just a few buttons that you click, you move around, you have a contained level where you maybe need to pick something up, run away from something, or just shoot something. And this is, I think, really good also thing to start with, but I think the interest wanes and the challenges go away very quick, and then you want to go to more fancy shooters, RPGs, stuff like that. So this one I would put directly into a noob list. So this is my game genre tier list. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree, and also if you like or don't like this format. I just thought it would be interesting to rank games, but not rank them by the genre that I like, but more by genres that I feel would be good for a specific skill level, to kind of give you a general idea, and also some things that you should never try, like MMOs, big RPGs, battle royales, MOBAs, or in general sandbox games. Maybe it's something that you can challenge yourself with, but in general, games with open worlds that need hours and hours or dozens of hours of content and need complex multiplayer, you just need to, stay away from them. So hopefully you enjoyed the video, and let me know in the comments if you like this format or not.